Have you ever stopped for a moment and looked back over your life and realized something strange? There were moments when everything felt like it was falling apart. Doors closed. People walked away. Plans failed. And at the time, it felt like you were losing. It felt like you were abandoned. It felt like heaven was silent. But then, months later, maybe even years later, you looked back and suddenly realized something that completely changed your perspective. That closed door actually protected you. That person leaving actually saved you from deeper pain. That delay actually positioned you for something better. And in that moment, you begin to see something powerful. You begin to see that even when you didn't understand it, even when it hurt, even when you cried and asked God, why? He was still working, quietly, faithfully, patiently. Because the truth is this: many of the greatest blessings in your life did not look like blessings at first. Sometimes they looked like loss. Sometimes they looked like rejection. Sometimes they looked like failure. But what if those moments were never accidents? What if every closed door, every delay, every painful season was actually part of a divine protection you couldn't see yet? You see, there are countless people today who believe God has forgotten them. They pray, but nothing seems to change. They believe, but the struggle continues. They hope, but the answers seem delayed. And slowly, doubt begins to whisper into their hearts. Maybe God isn't listening. Maybe God helped everyone else, but not me. But here is the truth you need to hear today. God has never stopped working in your life. Not for a single moment. Even in the seasons when you felt alone. Even in the nights when you cried yourself to sleep. Even in the moments when fear told you that everything was over. God was still there. Watching, guiding, protecting, fighting battles you didn't even know existed. The Bible shows us again and again that God often works behind the scenes before we ever see the miracle. Think about the story of Lazarus. When he died, it looked like the end. Everyone believed hope was gone. But then Jesus Christ stepped in and turned a hopeless situation into one of the greatest miracles ever witnessed. And maybe, just maybe, your story is not over yet either. Maybe the chapter you are in right now feels painful. Maybe you feel tired. Maybe you feel like you've been waiting for God to move for far too long. But what if this moment, this exact season of your life, is not the end of your story, but the moment right before God reveals what He has been doing all along? Because sometimes the greatest testimony is not the moment when everything goes right. Sometimes the greatest testimony is realizing that God was carrying you the entire time. So let me ask you a question. When someone asks you one day, "What has God done for you?" what will your testimony be? Because whether you realize it or not, God has been writing your testimony from the very beginning. There are seasons in life that test your faith in ways you never expected. Not because something dramatic happened overnight, but because nothing seems to happen at all. You keep praying. You keep believing. You keep hoping that something will change. Yet the days pass, the weeks pass, sometimes even years pass, and it feels like heaven is silent. Many people experience a moment like this. A moment where faith suddenly becomes difficult. A moment where you wonder if your prayers are even being heard. Maybe you prayed for a relationship to be restored, but the person still walked away. Maybe you prayed for an opportunity, but the door remained closed. Maybe you prayed for healing, but the struggle continued. And slowly, quietly, a dangerous thought begins to grow in your heart. Why isn't God answering me? But here is something most people misunderstand about faith. God's silence is not the same as God's absence. Just because you cannot see what God is doing does not mean He has stopped working. In fact, some of the most powerful things God does in a person's life happen in the seasons when nothing seems to be happening. Think about the story of Joseph. Joseph received a dream from God that he would one day rise to greatness. But almost immediately after that dream, everything in his life seemed to collapse. His own brothers betrayed him. They sold him into slavery. He was taken far from home, far from everything he knew. And if that wasn't enough, after working faithfully in Egypt, Joseph was falsely accused and thrown into prison. Imagine the confusion he must have felt. God had given him a dream, yet his reality looked nothing like that promise. Days turned into months. Months turned into years. And Joseph remained in prison. No promotion, no explanation, no visible miracle, just silence. But what Joseph could not see was that God was preparing something far greater than he imagined. God was positioning him, strengthening him, shaping his character. Because the palace Joseph was destined for required a man who had first been refined in hardship. And one day, suddenly, everything changed. Pharaoh had a dream that no one could interpret. And at that exact moment, someone remembered Joseph. Within a single day, Joseph went from prison to the palace. The years of waiting suddenly made sense. The suffering had a purpose. The delay had direction. What looked like abandonment was actually preparation. And the same pattern appears throughout the Bible. Look at the story of David. David was anointed to become king while he was still a young shepherd boy. But he did not become king immediately. Instead, he spent years running for his life, hiding in caves, being hunted by enemies, living in uncertainty. Imagine knowing that God had chosen you for something great, yet spending years in hiding and danger. It would have been easy for David to think, did God change his mind? But the truth was very different. Every battle David faced was preparing him to lead a nation. Every hardship was shaping the leader he would become. And if we are honest, this is where many people lose faith. They believe God when the promise is spoken, but they struggle to believe during the waiting. Yet the waiting season is often where God does his deepest work. Because before God changes your situation, he often transforms your heart. Before God opens the door, he prepares you for what is behind it. And before God reveals the miracle, he strengthens your faith. So if you are in a season where nothing seems to be changing, if you feel like your prayers are echoing into silence, if you feel like life has placed you in a place you never expected, remember this truth. God's silence does not mean God's absence. Sometimes the greatest miracles are being prepared in the quiet seasons of life. And one day, just like Joseph, just like David, you may look back and realize that the very season that felt like abandonment was actually the season God was preparing your greatest breakthrough. One of the most painful experiences a person can go through is losing someone they trusted. Not just losing them physically, but realizing that someone you believed would stay in your life suddenly disappears. A friend stops calling. A relationship slowly fades. Someone you cared about deeply walks away without explanation. And when that happens, the first feeling that often rises in your heart is confusion. You begin asking questions that have no easy answers. What did I do wrong? Why did they leave? Why would God allow this to happen? Sometimes the pain becomes even deeper when the person who leaves was someone you prayed for, someone you believed God brought into your life. And in those moments, it can feel like everything you believed about faith is being tested. But what many people do not realize is that God sometimes removes people from your life for reasons you cannot yet see. Not as punishment, not because you failed, but because he sees what you cannot see. He knows the direction your life is going. He knows the purpose he is leading you toward. And sometimes, certain people cannot go with you into the next chapter of that purpose. Think about the story of Abraham. When God called Abraham to leave his homeland and follow a new path, it was not a small decision. It meant stepping into the unknown, leaving behind security, leaving behind familiarity, and most importantly, trusting God without knowing the full plan. But the journey was not meant for everyone. Some relationships that once felt permanent were never meant to last forever. Because the direction God was leading Abraham required complete faith and obedience. And sometimes, the people around us may unknowingly pull us away from the very purpose God has for our lives. This is one of the hardest lessons in life. Not everyone who begins the journey with you will finish it with you. Some people are part of your life for a season. Some are there to teach you something. Some are there to strengthen your faith. But not everyone is meant to walk beside you forever. Even in the life of Jesus Christ, we see this reality. Jesus had many followers during his ministry. Crowds gathered around him. Thousands listened to his teachings. But when the path became difficult, when his message challenged people, many of those followers left. The crowd that once celebrated him began to disappear. And in one powerful moment recorded in the Gospel of John, many disciples walked away. Imagine what that must have felt like. People who once believed, suddenly turning back. But Jesus did not chase after those who chose to leave. Instead, he turned to the 12 disciples who remained and asked a simple but powerful question. Do you want to leave too? And one of the disciples, Peter the Apostle, responded with words that still echo through history. Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. That moment reveals something important about faith and relationships. There will always be people who walk away when the journey becomes difficult. But the ones who stay are the ones who truly belong in your story. Sometimes God allows certain relationships to fade not because they were meaningless, but because their role in your life has been completed. Think about it this way. If every person who entered your life stayed forever, your path would become crowded with voices pulling you in different directions. But God knows exactly who needs to remain in your life for the next chapter. He knows who will encourage your faith. He knows who will strengthen your purpose. And He knows who might unknowingly hold you back. So when someone leaves your life and the pain feels overwhelming, try to remember this truth. God is not just guiding your destination. He is also guiding the people who walk with you along the way. Sometimes the most painful separations are actually quiet acts of protection. Protection from relationships that would eventually harm your peace. Protection from paths that would pull you away from your calling. And one day, when you look back at the people who left your life, you may realize something surprising. Their departure was not the end of your story. It was the moment God cleared the path for the right people to enter it. Because when God is leading your life, every relationship has a purpose. Some are meant to stay, some are meant to teach, and some are meant to leave, so that your future can unfold exactly the way it was meant to. There comes a moment in many people's lives when the confusion finally begins to clear. Not immediately, not overnight, but slowly, quietly, the pieces of the story start to come together. At first, you may not even notice it. You simply realize that something inside you has changed. The pain that once felt overwhelming becomes lighter. The questions that once kept you awake at night begin to fade. And the people whose absence once broke your heart no longer hold the same power over your emotions. It is in this moment that many people discover something surprising. God was protecting them all along. Because when you look back at certain relationships from a distance, you begin to see things you couldn't see before. You notice the warning signs that were once invisible. You remember the moments when your peace was disturbed. You recognize the ways certain people brought confusion, pressure, or negativity into your life. But when you were in the middle of the relationship, you couldn't see it clearly. Your emotions were too involved. Your hope was too strong. Your heart wanted things to work. And sometimes that is exactly why God steps in. Not always through dramatic miracles, but through quiet changes that redirect your life. A conversation that leads to distance. An opportunity that takes you in a different direction. A door that closes even though you desperately wanted it to stay open. At the time, those moments can feel painful. They can feel unfair. They can even feel like loss. But years later, when you reflect on those moments, you begin to see something very different. You begin to see God's wisdom in the timing. Because there are relationships that look good on the surface, but would have slowly drained your spirit. There are opportunities that appear exciting, but would have taken you far away from the purpose God designed for your life. And there are paths that seem right in the moment, but lead to places where your peace slowly disappears. That is why sometimes God allows separation, not to punish you, but to protect your future. Think about the moment when Joseph finally stood before his brothers again after many years. These were the same brothers who had betrayed him, the same brothers who sold him into slavery, the same people whose actions caused years of suffering in his life. Yet when Joseph looked at them, he did not respond with anger or revenge. Instead, he spoke words that reveal one of the deepest truths about God's plan. He said something remarkable. What you meant for evil, God meant for good. In other words, even the painful parts of Joseph's story had a purpose. The betrayal, the prison, the years of waiting. All of it became part of a bigger plan that Joseph could not see in the beginning. And when he finally understood it, the bitterness disappeared. Because he realized that without those painful moments, he would never have arrived at the place where God needed him to be. This is one of the most powerful perspectives a person can develop in life. The ability to trust that even the difficult chapters of your story are leading somewhere meaningful. The truth is, you may not understand certain events while they are happening. You may not understand why certain people leave. You may not understand why certain doors close. But time has a way of revealing what once seemed hidden. Years later, you may meet the right person who treats you with a respect you never experienced before. You may step into an opportunity that changes the entire direction of your life. You may find a peace that once felt impossible. And suddenly you realize something surprising. If the people from your past had remained in your life, you might never have reached this moment. This realization can transform the way you see your past. Instead of seeing loss, you begin to see direction. Instead of seeing rejection, you begin to see protection. Instead of seeing broken plans, you begin to see a greater design unfolding. And when you finally recognize that truth, something inside your heart becomes lighter. You stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" And you begin asking a much more powerful question. What is God preparing me for next? Because every ending in your life is also the beginning of something new. And sometimes, the people who leave your life are simply making room for the blessings that are about to arrive. After people leave your life, something unusual often happens. Silence. Not the peaceful kind of silence at first, but the kind that feels uncomfortable. The phone stops ringing. The conversations become fewer. The people who once filled your life with noise are suddenly gone. And in that quiet space, many people begin to feel something they don't expect. Loneliness. It can feel like you have been left behind, like everyone else is moving forward while your life has somehow paused. But what most people don't realize is that this season of quiet is often one of the most important seasons God allows in a person's life. Because before God introduces new blessings, He often creates space for them. Imagine trying to plant something new in a field that is already overcrowded. The soil would have no room. The roots would have no place to grow. The new seed would struggle to survive. So before something new can grow, the field must first be cleared. This is exactly what happens in many people's lives. God begins removing distractions, removing voices, removing relationships that once filled your time and attention. And suddenly your life feels quieter than it has ever been before. At first, that quiet can feel like emptiness. But in reality, it is preparation. Because when your life becomes quiet, something powerful begins to happen. You begin to hear God more clearly. The constant noise of opinions fades away. The pressure to please others slowly disappears. And the voice that begins to guide your thoughts is no longer the voice of the crowd. It becomes the voice of God. Think about the story of Elijah. There was a moment in Elijah's life when he felt completely alone. He had just faced enormous conflict and pressure. Fear and exhaustion filled his heart. So he ran into the wilderness and hid in a cave. While he was there, something extraordinary happened. God chose to reveal Himself to Elijah, but not in the ways Elijah expected. There was a powerful wind that tore through the mountains. But God was not in the wind. There was an earthquake that shook the ground. But God was not in the earthquake. There was a blazing fire. But God was not in the fire. Then something very different happened. A gentle whisper. And in that quiet whisper, Elijah finally heard the voice of God. That moment reveals a powerful truth. God often speaks the clearest when life becomes quiet. But if our lives are constantly filled with noise, distractions, and people pulling us in different directions, we may never hear that whisper. That is why the season after certain people leave your life can become a sacred moment. A moment where God begins reshaping your heart. A moment where your identity becomes less dependent on other people's approval. A moment where your faith grows deeper than it has ever been before. During this season, many people discover parts of themselves they never noticed. Strength they didn't know they had. Dreams they had buried for years. A sense of direction that had once been clouded by the expectations of others. It is also during this season that your relationship with God can become stronger than ever. Not because everything is easy, but because you begin to rely on Him in ways you never did before. You begin to pray more honestly. You begin to listen more carefully. And slowly, the loneliness begins to transform into something else. Peace. A peace that doesn't depend on how many people surround you. A peace that comes from knowing God is guiding every step of your journey. And one day, while you are living in that quiet season, something unexpected begins to happen. New opportunities start appearing. New people begin entering your life. Doors begin opening in places you never expected. And suddenly you realize something incredible. The season of waiting was never empty. It was preparation. God was shaping your character, strengthening your faith, and clearing the path for the next chapter of your life. Because when God removes certain people from your life, He is rarely taking something away without purpose. He is making room for something better. And when that new season finally arrives, you will understand why the silence was necessary. Because sometimes, the quiet moments in life are where the greatest transformations begin. After a long season of silence, something unexpected begins to change. At first, it is almost unnoticeable. Life continues quietly. Your days feel more peaceful than before. You no longer chase relationships that drain your spirit. You no longer feel the same urgency to prove yourself to people who do not truly understand you. Instead, something deeper begins to grow inside you. Clarity. You begin to understand what truly matters. You begin to recognize the difference between people who simply pass through your life and people who genuinely belong in it. And then one day, often when you least expect it, something begins to happen. New people enter your life. But these relationships feel different from the ones you had before. There is less pressure, less confusion, less drama. Instead, there is a sense of peace. The conversations feel natural. The encouragement feels genuine. The connection feels healthy rather than exhausting. And that is often the moment when many people realize something important. God was not removing people from your life to leave you alone. He was preparing space for the right people to arrive. Think about the moment when David was running for his life. King Saul had turned against him. Danger followed David wherever he went. During that time, David could have easily become isolated and hopeless. But something remarkable happened. A group of men slowly gathered around him. These were not perfect people. Many of them had difficult pasts. Some were struggling. Some were searching for purpose. But they chose to stand beside David during one of the hardest seasons of his life. Over time, these men became known as David's mighty warriors. They were loyal. They were courageous. And they were part of the story that eventually led David to become king. But here is what is interesting. Many of those relationships formed during the most difficult chapter of David's life. Not when he was sitting on the throne. Not when he had power and recognition. But when he was hiding in caves and running through the wilderness. This reveals an important truth about the people God places in your life. The right people are not only present during your victories. They are also present during your struggles. They support you when things are uncertain. They encourage you when your faith feels weak. And they remind you of who you are when you begin to doubt yourself. These are the relationships that strengthen your journey, not the ones built on convenience, but the ones built on loyalty, faith, and purpose. And often, you do not recognize the value of these people until you have experienced the pain of losing the wrong ones. Because when someone has once drained your peace, you learn to value those who protect it. When someone has once brought chaos into your life, you learn to appreciate those who bring calm. When someone has once made you feel unseen, you learn to recognize the beauty of people who truly listen. This is how God reshapes your understanding of relationships. He teaches you not to chase every connection. He teaches you not to hold tightly to people who do not respect your heart. Instead, He shows you that the right people will walk beside you without forcing their place in your life. They will encourage your growth. They will celebrate your victories without jealousy. And most importantly, they will support the direction God is leading you. When those relationships appear, something powerful happens. Your journey becomes lighter. Your faith becomes stronger. Your purpose becomes clearer. Because you are no longer carrying the weight of relationships that were never meant to stay. Instead, you are surrounded by people who are aligned with the path God is preparing for you. And when that happens, you begin to understand something profound. God was never taking people away from you without reason. He was guiding your life with precision. Every person who left, every season of silence, every moment of confusion, was leading you toward this new chapter. A chapter where the people beside you are not obstacles to your purpose, but partners in it. And when you reach that point in your life, you realize something deeply comforting. God not only guides your path, He also carefully chooses the people who walk it with you. One day, every person will stand before God, not in a crowd, not hidden behind titles, not protected by reputation, just you and the truth of your heart. In that moment, nothing will matter more than one question. Did you truly know God, or did you only know about Him? This is why the warning of Jesus Christ in Gospel of Matthew chapter 7 is so powerful. Many people will say they believed. Many will say they served. Many will say they did religious things. But Jesus said something that should cause every believer to pause and reflect. I never knew you. Not I knew you once. Not you failed too many times. But something even deeper. I never knew you. In other words, the relationship was never real. This is the difference between religion and relationship. Religion can be performed. It can be displayed. It can be repeated in rituals and habits. But a real relationship with God changes the heart. It changes the way a person loves, the way they forgive, the way they walk through life when nobody is watching. And this is why moments in your life, when God removes certain people, closes certain doors, or leads you into quiet seasons are not random. They are invitations. Invitations to move beyond surface-level faith. Invitations to know God personally. Because in the end, the greatest tragedy is not failure. It is living an entire life believing you are close to God while never truly knowing Him. But the good news is this. Right now, you still have time. Time to seek God sincerely. Time to open your heart. Time to build a real relationship that is deeper than tradition or routine. Because when that day finally comes, the words you want to hear are not words of rejection. They are words of welcome. Words that echo through eternity. Well done. And when that moment arrives, you will realize something beautiful. Every quiet season, every closed door, every person God removed from your life was guiding you toward the most important relationship you will ever have. A relationship with God that lasts forever.